Okie then. Right, so lecture 3, Introduction to Video Games, Finding the Magic. Okay, so let's go over the basics, alright? So the first slide here, the title, The Joy of Limitations, okay? Now I think this is a really nice way to start off learning about video games. What do you think I mean? Can anyone guess by what I mean by limitations in video game music specifically?
Like synths and stuff like that they would have to use the program. They probably had about 3 or so things like sine, saw,
Right.
saw waves.
Right. Okay, so the limitations in terms of composition were great in the infancy of video game music, yeah? So we had a lack of space in these video game engines, okay? So not much space was dedicated to sound, so we were limited to very, very basic synthesis, basically. So generally what we used were sine waves, yeah, triangle waves, square waves, and noise waves to generate any kind of percussive sounds, all right? So we're talking about very, very basic sounds. Does anyone actually know what the first video game with sound was?
Pong,
Yes.
which was that like a table tennis game where the ball goes backwards and forwards.
I'm hoping that most of you have played Pong at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so that was the first game to ever have sound.
I think it was like
Now-
72 or something.
Say again?
I think it was like 1972.
It was the 70s, certainly. I can't remember what year in the 70s, but yes, you're correct. Well, it was actually released, I think, earlier than that without sound, okay? And it was a success. However, it really boomed in success when it was re-released with sound, okay? So what do you think is particularly functional about sound and music in video games? What does it do for us?
Indicates whether you're doing something right or wrong.
It can do, absolutely. I'm thinking on a broader sense. So as opposed to film and TV, how is video games different and how does the sound help with that?
Sort of associated with that particular game, it might have its own signature sort of characteristic.
That's also true, but think broader,
It's all like diegetic sound, so the sound effects correspond to what's happening in the video game, like...
Potentially. I mean, we're talking about music as well, though, not just sound.
Geographically, like as you said a few days ago, when it goes in the desert, it changes, and when it goes in the ocean, it changes.
Absolutely, these are all completely true, but I'm thinking more broadly, okay? So
It makes it more immersive, doesn't it?
that's it. That is the key term, okay? So video games are incredibly immersive, aren't they? Yeah, we're supposed to be involved in the story. We are altering the story, you know, as being a participant of the video game, okay? Because we're playing the game. Things change dependent on what we choose to do as part of the video game. So that is something really, really worth mentioning. So do you think sound and music in video games aids immersivity?
Oh yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. I would totally agree with you. Very, very much so. You know, we've got to a stage now where we have VR and AR, yeah, in video games, and the development of sound, the technology that goes into the sound now makes things so incredibly immersive. And I think once that technology has been nailed down, we are going to be entering into some really interesting psychological human effect, I think, when it comes to video games. And that's something we can discuss later on today. So, if we go right back to the beginning then, so we've just discussed what we've got now. If we go back to the beginning, there was a very, very limited possibilities of what composers could do and the sounds that they could use, all right? So let's explore that a little bit. So the majority of popular video game themes to date were composed using limited technology. We've just discussed that. The basic synthetic sounds that were available had to be used carefully as they lacked in natural tone and were without richness in colour. So do you remember me talking to you last semester about harmonic overtones? Yeah? And I think even I played a sine wave to you, didn't I? I think I did. I'm going to go with my gut. Yes, I think I did, all right? And a sine wave, when you hear a sine wave tone being played back, that has no harmonic overtones. None. It's just one frequency being played, which is very, very unusual to our human ear. That's what gives it that very kind of alien synthetic sound, okay? So when we're working with these very basic sound waves, whether it's a sine wave, triangle wave, whatever, these sounds are very alien to us. We can't find them in natural habitat. They have to be synthesized on a computer or a piece of hardware. So how do you think then that might affect our ears over time? I mean, I used to play, Super Mario on the SNES for about 8, 9, 10 hours with my brother on a weekend, and afterwards my ears would be ringing. Why do you think that might be?
Frequencies.
Yeah. So synthetic sound can be quite tiring to the ear, okay? So composers really have to be quite clever in their use of composition as to not tire out their audience's ears too quickly. Okay, so that's something we've really got to take into consideration, especially with our our class task today, okay? Okay, so this is another limitation. The amount of voices were limited, meaning very few sounds could be heard at one time. All right, what do we mean by that? Voices.
You can have notes that can be played at the same time.
Right, okay, so no more than one part can be played at once. So sometimes you can have a part which has 2 or 3 notes in it, but the way that it's implemented into the game, only one segment of music can be played at once, okay? So it was only really when we got to the Sega Mega Drive where we could overlay sounds, where voices could be played in synchronicity with one another, okay? And I believe that was 1990, where that came in, okay? So that, again, is a very, very limited thing to compose with. You can only hear one voice at a time. So you can't write anything particularly complex in terms of texture, in terms of harmony, okay? Great, so these are some of the important works that we should be looking at the infancy of video game music. Does anyone know who composed the music for Super Mario? No? He's a bit of a big deal. Huh? Huh?
It was on the video link.
I can't remember.
Japanese dude.
Yeah, Japanese dude.
Gender,
He's called Koji Kondo, sorry. Koji Kondo. So he's a bit of a big deal, basically. He's written, probably the most famous video game themes of all time. So Super Mario Brothers, Zelda as well, okay? It's a very important figure, Koji Kondo. We'll look at him later. Final Fantasy series as well, a guy called Nobuo Uematsu, also a Japanese composer, wrote the music for that. And then we've got Sonic, Star Fox, and Crash Bandicoot as a little add-ons there, okay? So, carrying on, composers had to adjust their writing to accommodate these limitations and often did this by relying heavily on melodic and thematic writing, okay? So what do we mean by melodic? Let's just go over that term. Melody, what is it? We had to describe it or define it in a few words. What is a melody?
Just a succession of notes.
Yeah, it's a tune, isn't it? Yeah, a melodic line is something usually that we can sing back. Yeah, it's a memorable line, okay? Hey, Sonia. Right, okay, so as opposed to melody then, what is thematic writing? What do we mean by themes? And this is the same in film and TV. What do we think of a theme?
Depending on what the theme of the game is, you create around it rather than just throwing anything on it.
Yeah, absolutely. A theme is usually associated with what?
Like a certain character or scenario or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So a theme, a musical theme, is usually something that is associated with a character, an environment. It has to be associated with something, okay? So thematic writing basically means using an element of what we're seeing and describing that in music or sound, okay? Cool. All right then, moving on. It is possible to link thematic material with that of the leitmotif. Remember me talking about the leitmotif? I think I've banged on about that enough by now. Okay, this is a technique that was established in the 1820s by an operatic composer called Wagner. Okay, so he was a very big deal and basically established that idea of thematic writing. Okay, where you'd associate a musical idea with a character or a place. Yeah? How do we think that might be super useful in a video game? The use of leitmotif.
Because it's really good with characters, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Imperial Death March or something.
Yeah.
Like when it's like dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
You know, as soon as that tune comes on, It's Darth Vader and the
Yeah.
bad guys.
Absolutely, absolutely. So John Williams, an absolute king of,
Yeah.
of that type of writing. So we kind of think of John Williams as today's Wagner, yeah, the guy that uses leitmotif in film music. Okay, so leitmotif in video games, though, I believe that they're particularly important and particularly successful because it helps us immerse ourselves into the story. Sometimes we can just hear a snippet of sound that will remind us of a character before we even see it, before we even see that character. Yeah? It's like you hear a certain sound in the game and you know that something bad or good is about to happen. So it's like these little sound bites that are thematic pieces of material which tell us information about what's happening in the game. Yeah? So leitmotif, excellent at doing that. Okay, right, so the more sophisticated the technology in video games, the greater the ability for a composer to write a game score, more similar to that in film or TV music. What do you think I mean by that? In terms of technology, if we're thinking about how technology has advanced, what in particular have we got now that we didn't in, say, the beginning of the 80s, that has enabled us to write closer to what film composers and TV composers are doing?
DAWs.
Right, DAWs. What about the game engines themselves? What about the games themselves? Like, what have they got that back then?
Blu-ray? Like more tighter graphics and stuff?
Not particularly. So, you know, we were saying about the use of synthesis back in the beginning of video game music. We had to use synthesis because there wasn't any space for audio, right? Audio files are a lot bigger than, you know, using these basic synth sounds, right? Wouldn't you agree? Cool. Have you ever seen the size of a MIDI file compared to the size of a WAV file? Yeah. So this is the same situation. You know, we actually physically didn't have the space in these video game consoles to handle any audio content. Now we do. Yeah. So, I mean, a really good example of it is The Last of Us. Has anyone heard of the game The Last of Us? Yeah. So the video game score for that was actually composed for a 100-piece orchestra. All right. And it had over 3.5 hours worth of music in it, okay? So that is obscene. That is so much audio content that can now be easily implemented into the game. So we have the technology now to be able to squeeze all of this stuff inside a video game, all right? And be able to process it quickly. When back then, we really couldn't. I mean, we've come such a long way. So can you see then how video game scores, as the more we go towards contemporary modern times, they become more similar to film scores and TV scores. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Can we kind of see that kind of that alignment going on? Now, some composers tend to actually just, you know, stick with the traditional techniques. A lot of composers still use chiptune, for example, because it's almost nostalgic. Mm-hmm. Yeah? In fact, I read an article today that there's a guy that has created a new game for Sega Mega Drive. With a cartridge and everything, and he hired a composer to use the limited technology, and I just think that's great. I think that's wicked that you can still use those techniques. Okay, cool. So let us have a little listen and watch for one of the most iconic pieces of video game music ever. Okay, oh, skipping ahead, there we are. Skip Great. Awesome. It's so nostalgic, isn't it? Is there anybody in this room who hasn't heard that before? Ooh. Has anybody not heard that before, just out of interest? No, so you all have. Yeah? Great. Good news. Okay, so is there anything that is particularly striking about the use of melody here? What do you think it does? What's its functionality?
Stick in your head.
What was that?
To stick in your head.
To stick in your head?
remember.
It's really quite catchy, isn't it? Yeah. Anything else?
Is it called a hook when it's like really catchy like that?
I mean, you'd call it a hook if it was part of a song, but this is more of a score, so I don't know if you can call it a hook necessarily. It's very much a theme, isn't it? That is Mario's theme. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba. As soon as you hear that, da-da-da-da-da, you know it's Mario, don't you? Just in the first 4 or 5 notes, you know it's going to be Mario. So that is very much a good example of a thematic piece of material there. So how many different melodies or pieces of music could you hear in that very short clip? Did anyone count them?
I didn't count.
You didn't count them?
But I did notice each one as it sort of went on. So it was just like even little things like for sound effects, like jumping and
There's quite a lot.
the Super Mario bit as well. Which is another.
I want to focus
theme
on that.
from,
I want to focus on the music first, and then we'll go into the sound effects. Okay, so the melodic material, I counted 3 separate melodies. All right, so we're going to watch it again, and I want you to try and identify the 3 different melodies, okay, and what they are doing. What are they telling us? These different melodies. So this is the first one, okay? Did we all count 3 of them? Cool, so the first one we know is Mario's theme. Okay, so we can skip over that one. What was the second one?
When he got the super power up and it sped up, so he
Yeah.
started running really quickly.
Absolutely, so that ba 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 ba. Yeah, okay, cool. So that very much was another theme representing the power up. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, cool. And the third one then?
Victory, yeah.
Yeah, that theme. Okay, so we've got 3 different themes going on, representing 3 different events happening on screen, right? So I've played, well, I can't even tell you how many hours I must have played this game for with my brother. And I know that whenever I hear those specific melodies, I know what's happening. Like I actually get like some kind of like happy hormone release whenever I hear that da-da-da-da-da-da, because it feels like I've achieved something. It's like something that's just embedded itself into my brain because I've heard it so many times, and it actually, makes me feel happy and nostalgic. Just hearing it, I don't even have to look at the screen. And that sound indicates something good, that I've achieved something. So can we see how leitmotif and thematic material can really be immersive? Yeah, especially with games that are repetitive like this, with repetitive formulas. Like, okay, you finish the level, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, yeah? So those kind of techniques create this real deep sense of immersivity, all right? So that's something we really, really must keep in mind. Okay? Great, moving on. How do I make this big? There we go. Just check we're in the right place. Yeah, okay, so linear music as opposed to non-linear music, okay? There are 2 very different types of music in video games. One being linear, the other being non-linear, okay? So we're going to focus on linear music to begin with. Does anyone, before we go on, particularly could you guess what linear music might be? What could linear music be? If we're thinking about video games.
With a story.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, something that follows a narrative, yeah? Okay, so it's important to note that linear music is composition that is fixed to time, okay? Meaning that no matter what we do in the game, the music will remain the same. It will not change, okay? So very much like a film score or a TV score, it is fixed to time, yeah?
So you say it won't change, then it won't
It
automatically change at all? Or just
No.
sequence?
It won't change, okay? It might loop over and over again, but that segment is fixed to time, and there's nothing that we can do as a game player that will change that happening, okay? Great. So linear game music is composed with a set musical structure that does not change as it plays and as time passes, okay? So the way that I like to think of it is it's just like a DAW. You write your music in the DAW, it starts from the left, it finishes on the right, and that is how it is. It's just fixed, yeah? Fixed to a timeline, fixed to time, okay? So just as linear game narrative unfolds, so just as the story of the game unfolds, with a predetermined set of visual events, okay, a piece of linear game music will play with a planned compositional structure. So what I mean by linear game narrative might be something like an introduction to a game or an outro to a game. What's the other big one that is fixed in a video game? What do we have other than the gameplay itself in a video game? What was that? Cutscenes, absolutely. So loading screens, cutscenes being the big one, menu screens. I don't know, for example, in Zelda when you go in the shop, that's another one where the music is fixed to time. There is nothing that you can do in the gameplay to stop the music playing back as it does. Okay, so any I can't speak today. Any linear game narrative will usually be accompanied by linear game music. Okay. So essentially what we're looking at are tiny little films that are happening inside the video game. That's how I like to see it. Yeah? Cutscenes being a really good example of that. I think that they're often called cinematics now as well because obviously they look so real. So they're often called cinematics. Great. So linear music can either be a one-shot or a loop. Okay? One-shots are almost always a piece of music that is synced or locked to picture. Okay, so a one-shot basically meaning that it plays once. Okay, it's triggered and it plays once. So for example, at a cutscene, at the beginning of the cutscene, that music will start playing and that will finish. Yeah, it'll happen once, okay? Or it will be a loop, okay? Linear loops, these are something that we really must learn how to create if we're thinking about writing music for games, okay? What is important about a linear loop, do you think? What mustn't we do by creating loops?
Loop seamlessly, so
Ah.
like jump between, not like it's like a second gap between it starting again.
Exactly. So do you think that potentially means we'd have to alter the way we compose? Definitely. Okay, so I know that for sure because I use linear loops in the Lego video games. That's what I use linear loops. So everything that I write, when I begin writing it, I know that the end of my piece has to loop exactly back round to the beginning. The goal is that the player won't even notice that it's looping. That is the goal, okay? It's a lot harder than it sounds, okay? It is very, very difficult, especially if you've got, a very, very long developmental piece and then it's got to come back to the beginning very quickly in a short space of time. That can be quite a challenge. So yes, we do as composers have to adjust the way in which we write in order to create these seamless loops. And that's in non-linear music as well as linear, but in linear it can be a bit more challenging. Right, okay, so in game music we call these cinematics. A cinematic could be an introduction, an ending, or a cutscene, or like we said, it could be a menu screen, it could be a loading screen. When you die, it could be that pattern of music that happens. Okay, so who's played Gears of War in here? A couple of you? Wicked game. It's really, really good. And this is the opening cinematic to the latest Gears of War game, which I haven't actually played yet. So enjoy.
For a time, the humans of Sarah knew the illusion of peace. Until Emergence Day. In time, their valiant defense was crushed, with billions dead. Humans denied their enemies at home by destroying their own civilization. The long struggle against overwhelming odds approaches a final, desperate stand.
All right, so anything particularly interesting about the use of music here? Is it similar to anything that we've possibly covered before in this module?
It's all orchestral, mostly.
Yeah. It's pretty much like a film, guys, isn't it? There's not much separating that from a film score or, you know, a scene from a TV series or something like that. There really isn't much difference, is there? And this is a very contemporary, very modern game. So like you said, Rich, there is that use of the full orchestra, yeah? So can you imagine how much processing power that takes to actually run all of those audio files inside a game engine? It's quite considerable, yeah? And the use of graphics as well. I mean, that's pretty incredible, the use of graphics there as well. Okay, so like I said before, as time goes on, the more advanced technology gets, the more similar scoring, video game scoring becomes towards film and TV, okay? Cool. So at the other end, we've got Super Mario 64. Who's played this game? Yes.
Yeah, I have.
It's just the best thing. I have it as a...
this game when I was younger.
I have it on my Wii U, and it's been taunting me for about 3 months, and I can't, because I know as soon as I pick it up, I won't be able to put it down again, and it's just...
What, you've got Super Mario 64 on your Wii, haven't you?
Yeah, you can download all of the old 64 games on your
that's
Wii U
really
now,
cool.
which, well, it's dangerous, let's put it
Yeah,
that way.
that is.
Right, okay, so here we go. This is actually a very good example of a linear loop, guys. This is a linear loop, all right? So the music doesn't change regardless of what is happening inside the game. Just the themes that are being played will just loop around and around and around, dependent on the environment. Okay? So let's put that into context. Try and find where the loops might be. Okay? Try and find it.
Hegel.
So we're concentrating on this bit here now. Did anyone catch it? Was it seamless? Pretty great loop. So I'll show you where it was. One, two, three, four, here. So the same loop, just over and over and over again. So no matter how long it took him to slide down that slide, it will just loop that piece of music over and over and over again. So the way in which Koji Kondo in this case has composed this is so that the end of one segment, I like to think of it as like almost like a piece of ribbon. So you've got a length of ribbon, and you can take this end and then pull it back to the beginning, and that creates a seamless loop, okay? So that's what we're all aiming for when writing loops in video games. Okay. Moving on. Great. So we've done linear music. Moving on to non-linear music then. So what do you think will be different in kind of basic terms in comparison to linear music? What is happening in non-linear music then? How is it different?
It's not repetitive and it changes probably scene or progression.
Right, okay. Yeah. So the key to linear music is that the game player will not be able to change the outcome of the music no matter what they do in the game. This is the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
So if I got like a power up, it would change.
Exactly. So you know that clip from Super Mario Brothers that we watched at the beginning? That was non-linear, wasn't it? Because when he got the power up, it changed the music. When he finished the level, it changed the music. So very much a good example of non-linear there, okay? So a really good example of non-linear is racing games, okay? This is one of the simplest ways I can describe it. So if we can imagine you've got a racing level, okay, you've got your racing track, your racing music, basic track that's going on and on and on and on and on. And then we've got another track that's running alongside it, okay, but it only gets triggered at a certain event in the game, okay? So I'm sure all of you guys have played racing games where you get a boost, yeah, and maybe there'll be an added percussive layer, or it'll speed up or something like that. Something will happen in the music to tell us that we've got a power up or, you know, a boost or something like that. So we'll have our normal racing music, and then when the event happens, there's another track that plays underneath it. Yeah? So that's kind of how we can describe non-linear music. It's a very basic way of describing it. So the most important point is that non-linear music is interactive. It is immersive, okay? Okay, it's interactive music that is triggered by certain game events that are in control by the player. So the player is the person that triggers the music by doing certain events inside the game. Cool, so we can have rendered music as non-linear. So that's basically just a composition that's been bounced to audio, okay, and then put inside the game engine. So that's one option. We also have unrendered music, separate musical elements that are stored in a bundle rather than a single audio file and then implemented into the game. So this is a bit more complex, okay? So unrendered music in a bundle. What do you think that might mean? How can we look at unrendered music that hasn't been bounced into one file? So you've got segments of music.
It'd be like several tracks in the door underneath.
Yeah. Absolutely it is. So what do we call those? Especially once we deliver them, what do we call them? Stems. Okay, so I really, really like to think of unrendered music as stems. Yeah? So basically what we've got is we've got a breakdown of the final piece. Yeah? So what tends to happen with video game composers who compose non-linear music is that they'll create a final piece, okay? They'll create a complete piece and they'll break it down into parts, yeah? And then what can happen is you can trigger those parts at separate times or even layer them up. Yeah, so you can start with very, very basic and then build it up if it's a scene where the tension builds. Or you can kind of trigger them at different points, keeping the music interesting, okay? So how do you think that might change the compositional process? Is that a different way to working with linear music? To me, I think it's a completely different ballgame. Yeah? So you're thinking of music as a sum of its parts rather than a composition, a full composition. Yeah? That's how I see non-linear music. So very much, Rob, that's a good example when you have all of your tracks laid out in a DAW. Think of it that way, and soloing and muting them in different orders, different combinations. That's a good analogy.
Which corresponds to what's going on screen.
Exactly. So whenever you press solo or mute on any of the tracks, that will be triggered by a certain event in the game, and that will be pre-programmed by the game designer.
And rendered music would just be like bouncing the whole project down into a file and just putting
it inside the game.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Is that kind of an idea that you can wrap your heads around at this stage?
Yeah.
Ish? Who doesn't quite understand that concept? Because I'm more than happy to go over it again. Good. Okay, cool. Right. So horizontal resequencing, guys, and this is another way of explaining what non-linear music is. So this is the notion that the structure of the musical sequence can be rearranged. Yeah, so there isn't a fixed structure. Okay, so like with linear music, it goes from left to right, the beginning of the piece through to the end of the piece, and then it could loop or not. With horizontal resequencing, we can have bits of music that can be reordered, okay? So I like to think of it as nugget composing. I like this word, okay? So you're thinking in terms of segments of music rather than these long developed ideas, okay? So I've just interrupted myself, haven't I? So the notion that the structure of a musical sequence can be rearranged rather than the traditional concept of music travelling in conjunction with time, okay? So again, that idea of the DAW where the music is fixed to a timeline from left to right. We can relate this to how music moves in a DAW from left to right. There we go. Okay, guys, so this is a really good example of non-linear music, okay? I'm going to skip it along, and I want you to tell me where you can hear the non-linear music event happening. Did you guys catch it?
Was it when he went across the finish line?
Yeah, when he went on to the final lap.
Final lap, classic. It's classic, basically. In all racing games, final lap, there'll be some kind of trigger that either ups the intensity of what we're already hearing, or it'll be a different piece of music altogether. So did you hear the tempo ramped up? Yeah, and then we had an added layer of percussion. That's a perfect example of non-linear music. So what other non-linear sound elements were there? Did anyone catch them?
When you went over an item box.
Yeah, when he went over an item box. Anything else?
Change when told him what power up he got.
Yeah, absolutely. And the coins as well. So all of those are non-linear music events, aren't they? They're not fixed to time. They only happen when certain events happen on screen. So they are interactive. Yeah? So sound effects, very much a non-linear discipline, guys. Great. Anything that you want me to go over with this one before we move on? Got lots of content to get through. Great, okay. Cool, so we're going to have a look at 3 case studies, guys. Firstly, we're looking at Koji Kondo. Absolute badass, completely legendary. Okay, so I've labelled him the melody maker. All right, he was the first, I think the first employee of Nintendo, actually. Yeah, first composer hired by Nintendo, okay? So everyone previous to him who worked in the sound departments were also the game devs, the game designers themselves. All right, so composers weren't actually hired until this guy came along. All right? Great, so although sound was important before Koji, for example, Space Invaders and Pong, that kind of thing, the musicality of it wasn't. Okay, so before Koji Kondo, what did music do? What was the function?
It was just like 8 little square waves which would correspond to what's going on screen.
Yeah, it was to communicate information, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But when Koji came along, it became an art form. It was musical. Yeah, the musicality of video game scores was important because of the immersion of this guy. Okay, so 8-bit chips within the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, enabled musical scores to be generated for the first time. Okay, so this obviously corresponds with the technology that was given at this point. So 8-bit chips, I mean, 4-bit does exist, but it's barely audible. Has anyone actually bit crushed their stuff to 4-bit before? Sounds pretty nasty, almost unbearable. So 8-bit chips really was the first time where we could listen to melody for extended periods of time without going completely insane. Okay, so Kondo was an expert in utilising the console's sonic limitations. Okay, that should be in bold and in red, okay? So sonic limitations, what do we mean by that? And not Sonic the Hedgehog.
Like the engines and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, like the development in the actual console, because they have certain chip cards and stuff which store all the music on. So like back then when it would have been the N64 or whatever, it was like a lot more limited to the PS4.
Oh yeah, massively. But N64 when it came along was a huge advance in, especially in game audio actually. 64-bit, who would have thought? Amazing.
Is that why it's called the N64?
Yeah.
Because it's
64 sample rate.
Yeah.
The first console to do it.
I remember when I was really young, I thought it was because of the date it was made, 1964.
Oh no, that would make me really old. So shh, no. Okay, so Kondo was an expert in utilising the console's sonic limitations, basically meaning that he mastered the ability of creating music and sound without having to layer things over and over and over again, without having to use really high-tech sounds. He did it through the use of melody, okay? So his strengths were in the composition itself rather than the production of sound. Yeah? Does that make sense? So if we listen to the Super Mario theme, for example, let's go back to that clip. Oh. Break it down into parts. What are we hearing? Is it particularly complicated? The sound, is it complicated?
Not particularly.
It's really basic,
There's like
isn't it? It's just a
really
square wave.
one noise for every movement he does.
One voice, one square wave, that's it. But the melody, the melodic content, it's bizarre. It's really, really unusual and quite complex. It's jazzy, you know? It's really quite weird, isn't it? It's quite chromatic and very, very jazzy in terms of its harmony. Same goes here. So although the sound that is being used is incredibly basic, the melodic material is not. Yeah, the melodic material is really quite sophisticated, and that is how he utilized the console's sonic limitations. And the greatest thing is, guys, he still does it. He still creates music in this way. And it's particularly successful because those melodies often refer to a character that's on screen or an environment that we can see. So it's an incredibly immersive way of writing video game music. Okay, where were we? Great. Oop, don't edit it, no. Right. Cool. So his simple melodic writing encapsulates the required mood for each of the game environments that he composed for. Okay. So that's another thing that we must note about Koji Kondo is that his depiction of environment through the use of melody was absolutely superb. The way in which he writes meant that you would know exactly where you were without even looking at the screen. Yeah, I mean, I've played enough video games to know that certain melodies sound like certain environments. And I'm sure you guys would know it too, even if it's on a subliminal level, on a subconscious level. Okay, so there's a couple of good examples that I'll play you that hopefully will prove that point. So his incredible skill is required to write with such variation using such basic tools, okay? So all of his material really does rely on the melodic nature of it, okay, rather than the quality of the sound. And as I said before, Kondo continues to write in this simplistic fashion even when the technology advanced over time. So this is a good example of that. So has anyone played Wind Waker? It's a Zelda game. Okay, so it was originally released on the GameCube, I believe, and this is the Wii U version, okay? So when the Wii U came about, there's total capability of implementing audio into video games. However, listen to the score. Let's go to the beginning. Here we go. Is that audio? Is that a live recorded? Nope. That's not a real cello, is it? And he chose to keep it this way. So he still chooses to use the limited ways of composition, and it's incredibly effective, I think, just through the use of melody, having that limitation of not being able to layer, multiple files and not having to use a full orchestra, it does actually give this very nostalgic, very pleasing aesthetic, in my opinion. So when I was listening to that, and I've listened to it a few times now, when I hear Link's theme come up, do you know what I mean by Link's theme? So that one. When you hear that, there is again that similar feeling that I get when I've completed a level in Mario. I actually can feel myself getting excited when I hear that theme, okay? So that's another good example of thematic material, where a melody will remind you of a certain event or remind you of, some kind of nostalgic moment. Okay, so this is a really, really good video by a guy called Seth Everman. I suggest you check out all of his stuff because he's hysterical. This is a very, very good video describing how themes and use of music to display environment can be very, very useful.
The final of the game's total.
Okay, so that's a very, very good example of how specific sounds and specific melodies can really demonstrate an environment, and especially down to the kind of one-shot sounds as well, where you've got the ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. You know that that's a success. You know that that's an achievement sound, and that you know that is you dying or not succeeding. So these kind of sound bites, these thematic pieces of musical material are absolutely crucial in composition for video game. Okay. Great, so that's Koji for you. Now let's have a little look at Nobuo. Right, so this is Nobuo Uematsu, and he is the king of leitmotif. So Koji Kondo, very much the king of melody, and this guy kind of pushes melody towards leitmotif, all right? So the ability to associate any thematic material to a character or a place. This guy especially is excellent at associating musical themes with characters, okay? So has anybody played Final Fantasy here, especially 7? Final Fantasy 7?
Yeah, I played that.
One of the best games ever. So chock full of these thematic leitmotifs, okay? Right, so the style of Uematsu's compositions are diverse, ranging from stately classical symphonic pieces to heavy metal to jazz and hyper-percussive techno-electronica. So he's a very versatile composer. He, composes in multiple genres. He doesn't necessarily have a fixed style or genre that he writes to, okay? However, the thing that he does do consistently is the use of leitmotif, all right? So his Final Fantasy music has been described as being able to convey the true emotion of a scene. As an example, Eris theme in Final Fantasy VII, so arguably one of the saddest cutscenes in video game history. Okay, so we'll watch that in a sec. So he has also been called the John Williams of the video game world. So many of John Williams' film scores use themes to represent specific characters. Classic case of a leitmotif, okay? So I think what we'll do is we'll actually watch this clip from Jaws first. so I think we've all spotted the leitmotif there, right, guys? Right? Please
Yeah.
tell me you did. So what was it?
Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, 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 dun. Just that 2-note repeated theme. Dun, 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 dun. And what does it represent? Jaws, the shark. Yeah? Okay, so we know this to be a fact because look at the perspective of the camera. Who are we at this point? The actual shark. That isn't a perspective of a beachgoer, is it? We are being put through the eyes of the shark at this point. And that is consistent throughout the whole film. That theme only comes up when we are looking at the world through the eyes of the shark. So it's very, very much a use of leitmotif, yeah? Where a theme, just that 2-note theme, dun dun, represents the shark, okay? Cool. Let's move on. Cool. So a leitmotif is a short, constantly recurring musical phrase associated with a particular person, place, or idea. We've gone over that before. So although usually a short melody, it can also be a chord progression or a simple rhythm, okay? So it doesn't actually have to be melodic, all right? Leitmotif doesn't have to be a melodic theme. It could be a rhythmic pattern. So maybe if you heard, that would mean that the baddie was about to come out, or it could be the beginning of a boss fight or something like that. Okay, that is still a leitmotif. Just because it's not melodic doesn't mean that it's not a leitmotif. Okay, so leitmotifs can help to bind a work together into a coherent whole. What do you think I mean by that? How can it bind a piece of work together? So how can it make a video game kind of come together? Feel more complete, maybe. So these thematic pieces of music can be developed over time, yeah? So you could have a leitmotif for a certain character, but it could be played back in a different way dependent on what's happening at that point in the game. So for example, Aerith's theme is a really, really good one that we can discuss. So let's watch that and we can have a chat about it after. Oh, I'm giving it away. Here we go. Okay, cool. So did we all catch what Aerith's leitmotif was? Or when it came? I'll show you. It's basically when the sword came out again, so... Was it when she fell to the floor? I can't remember. Yeah. So it's quite a shift, isn't it? It's quite a dramatic shift in music, yeah? There's even like a real kind of cut in there going on. Okay, so that is very much associated to that character, that bum 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 ba 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 bum, that melodic theme. is very much Eris's theme. However, the way in which it's played back, okay, the way in which it's played, the instrumentation of it changes dependent on the emotive content that's happening at that point. So have you noticed that it was very, very sparse in texture? So it was a harp and piano. That was really it. Yeah, so a very feminine, very delicate, very sad portrayal of that theme, okay? Now, throughout the game, that theme is repeated, okay, but in very, very different ways, dependent on what's happening in the storyline. So there is a theme where it's like, bum, ba, bum, ba, da, ba, da, and it's more of an adventurous version of that theme, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, that a theme can be reworked to kind of indicate different emotions or events that are happening at that time. Yeah? Relatively makes sense? Good. Cool. So that's a bit of Nobuo for you. Now, next and lastly, in terms of case studies, we're going to look at Disaster Piece. Now, he's one of my favourite producers generally. I think he makes some incredible music. And I think the latest thing that he's done that was kind of mainstream was the score to It Follows, if any of you have seen that. It's a kind of rubbish film, really, but the score is great. So he's an electronic composer. Okay, mostly known for the indie game Fez, if any of you have potentially played that before, any of you? It's great, so it's a fantastic game, beautiful as well. So the entire sound source was generated using the native instrument synthesizer Massive, okay? So those of you who are interested in synthesis or potentially writing video game scores in the future, I would strongly suggest you watch this guy. Okay, this is a really useful workshop that he gives on how he created sounds inside the game. And he just used Massive, and that was it. I think he used a couple of external post effects, but all of the sound was created in Massive, which I think is really quite impressive. So yeah, an addition of effects such as bit crush and reverb helped to develop his distinct chiptune sound. So it's not just that typical chiptune sound, but he's added his own twist on it with his use of effects. So, Disaster Pieces game scores majoritively represent the environmental content of the game as opposed to a specific event or character, okay? So this isn't leitmotif, okay? This is not leitmotif. So it's more like soundscaping, yeah, through the use of music. So this suggests that the music represents what we see rather than what the characters on screen feel, okay? One might describe his work as atmospheric composition. I think that's probably the best term for it, okay? Atmospheric composition as opposed to the use of leitmotif. Events are usually depicted through stingers and sound effects rather than the musical score, okay? So any events that are actually happening and being triggered by the player of the game is usually depicted through sound via sound effects or stingers, yeah? So this is a good example. Let's have a look at Fez. I think we have to go quite far in. Oh, I need to adjust this. I actually imported the wrong video here, so I need to find it on YouTube. This one was one with the sound turned off, so I don't know why I put that in the slideshow. Fez gameplay. Where was it? I think it was this guy. Yeah. Notice how the sound didn't change now that we're in the menu screen? Yeah, there's no indication really to, you know, as to what the game player is actually doing. It's just this atmospheric sculpting of sound. I think that's a good example. we notice there?
So it hasn't changed, but he's diminished a few chords or something, and it kind of sticks to the back and like a few kick drum and
Right.
basic snare or something.
Absolutely. So when we're in the outdoors, I'm sure you'll all agree this is a very kind of playful image, isn't it? Very, very bright colours. It's quite basic in terms of its shape. Yeah. So
Is this game quite recent?
it's relatively recent.
2011. So it's got like
Yeah.
a really retro style with how the
Yeah.
like language pops up, because they
Yeah.
would have had the technology by this point to have it so the characters can speak.
Yeah. It's an intentionally retro
Yeah.
game,
it's kind of
intentionally nostalgic,
a bit
I
like
believe.
the music as well.
Yeah,
It's quite a lot of
exactly.
Basic like square waves and stuff you can hear.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of very, very basic stuff going on, but I like to say that, you know, when it's done well, when simplicity is done well, you know, it can be something quite special. In my opinion, this
Yeah.
video game is very special. But yeah, so what we notice then is when we're out in this open environment, we're hearing lots of bright sounds, lots of major chords. Very brassy, very kind of light and bright. And then when we go underground, Imran, you made a really, really good point. Notice how all of that melodic material and all of those sounds have disappeared, and all we're left with is just that loop, that drum loop, yeah? So that is a non-linear mechanic in terms of the music, but really what we're getting is a sculpting of environment through the use of music, yeah? So you've got all those bright colours, all of those lovely majory chords, and then we go into the dark underground. And all of a sudden the texture thins out and we're left with just the drums, yeah? So it's almost like a kind of, I don't know, it's like a sonic explanation that we have changed location, yeah? That we are in a different environment.
It's almost as if like the quiet sounds the sound of the outside world, and you go inside,
Yeah.
you can only hear yourself. Kind of thing.
Absolutely, it's almost like a heartbeat, isn't it? It's almost like an internal thing. Yeah, great observation, Rich, really good. Cool. So, that is Disaster Piece, and we've come to the end of the lecturing half of our class, okay? So how about, where are we now, 20 to